3 years. 3 years of waking up beside someone whose face became part of the furniture, always there, never looked at. 3 years of setting a place at the breakfast bar and pulling a cup toward an absence. Emily Peterson had learned to move through the Anderson mansion like a ghost learns the house, quietly, with a kind of practiced reverence that keeps the floors intact and the windows clean, but does not invite anyone to look inside. At 6 in the morning, the kitchen smelled of coffee and lemon soap. The city outside Los Angeles was still catching its breath. The palm trees threw long, patient shadows across the driveway. Emily slid a plate across the marble island, seconds of ritual she had carried for more than 1,000 mornings. Toast, strawberry jam, a small folded napkin with a pen in its pocket for his notes. She left it where his hand would find it, as she had been taught to do. He never reached for it. "You're watching from where?" she heard herself ask, not out loud, not to someone in the room, but as though the question could echo into the world and pull a stranger's voice back. It was a habit of the new century, that the world expected you to speak into a device and be heard. She imagined a dozen invisible cities answering in a chorus. It was a silly thought, and for a moment, as sunlight striping the island made diamonds out of crumbs, Emily let herself imagine a different life. One with a small apartment, a desk, a window she could open to let the city in. Not a mansion that filtered light through curtains and polished silence. She put on a navy dress and smoothed the fabric over her hips the way she had smoothed things for others all her life. The necklace William had given on their wedding night, an heiress's token, wrapped in corporate signatures, sat like a script around her throat, beautiful, declarative, unreadable. She fastened it with fingers that knew their way around bills, scanners, and late-night hospital forms, fingers that had once taught a classroom of teenagers to love literature. Once she had been visible for reasons she had chosen. The difference hurt. This was not romance. This had been a bargain. It had started 3 years earlier with a voice in a hospital corridor, and the weight that comes when your parents tell you the house will be sold unless someone steps in. David and Sarah Peterson, gentle, thrift-conscious, reliably proud, had exhausted time and credit and every inglorious plea the system allowed. They had sat across from a man who measured people in terms of leverage and patience, in a conference room where light came in straight rectangles and lawyers wore expressions like polished armor. Robert Anderson had not smiled. He had offered a rescue as one might offer a contract, a sum large enough to erase the past and shape the future, in exchange for a marriage between his son and the woman who carried the Peterson name. It would be a union on paper, the lawyers insisted. A public alignment, perhaps, for the Anderson empire. A private expedient, it was called in all the right ways. Emily had thought of her parents' hands, the way her mother dug into flour when she was old, the way her father blinked at invoices and still pretended the numbers were nothing. She had thought of the classroom at the community college, where a stack of overdue library books bore her name like a secret. She had signed the papers, because some debts were louder than pride, and she had walked toward the life that looked like safety for others. William Anderson had been polite. William Anderson had been distant. He was the sort of man who could hold entire departments in his gaze and make them tidy. The first time they shared a room after the ceremony, he offered the same professional civility his employees experienced: a nod, a schedule, and itinerary for their public appearances. "We will maintain the public narrative," he had said. "We will be strategic." The marriage had been a ledger line. For 3 years, Emily lived inside that ledger. She carried out her obligations with care, appearing at charity luncheons, endorsing the right causes, learning which guests to laugh with and which to ignore. In private, the house was softer and crueler. There were evenings when William read reports at a dining table set for 2, while Emily sat across and read beside him, the sound of turning pages the only conversation. Once, inches apart as they watched a documentary on war strategy, she reached for his hand to point at something small and human on the screen. His fingers tightened around the remote. They did not meet. Los Angeles had a way of pretending not to care about secrets and also making them spectacular. The city put on its finest when it wanted to be admired. Hotels with lobbies that smelled of citrus, photographers who smelled of flashbulbs and ambition, people who wore night suits as armor and smiles as currency. It was to such a place that the Andersons traveled the spring the story opened again. "I want you at my side,"
William told her the week of the gala, in that same controlled voice, as though choosing outfits for a public relations calendar. It will be an evening worth our attendance. She could have said no. She thought about her parents and how they would sleep easier with the mortgage off their backs, about the students she still tutored once a week online, about the small gratitude that came in the form of being useful. She found the navy dress she'd kept for appropriate occasions, the one with a modest neckline and a seam that made her shoulders look steady. She let herself be a prop, because the family she loved were no longer in the position to refuse. At the gala, Los Angeles glittered like an invitation.
William moved through the room with the assurance of someone who had practiced owning space. He stood at the center of conversations as though all lines returned to him. Emily followed like a shadow with a shape. Guests fluttered around them, philanthropists who could name their impact in numbers, journalists with polished smiles. 1,000 small engines of approval hummed. Richard Thompson spotted her because he saw her, not the necklace, not the placement at the arm of Anderson Holdings' heir, but the way she spoke when a charity director asked about education programs. He lingered, the sort of charming man who dresses danger as generosity. Broad grin, soft laugh, a manner that made people feel like protagonists in their own lives. "You're the one who runs the after-school program?" he asked, leaning in the way rich men lean toward the possibility of novelty. His eyes had the practiced interest of an investor sniffing a possible venture. "I read about it in a piece. The way you connect, it's rare." Emily felt something in her chest that wasn't appreciation and wasn't pain, but an odd new warmth. She answered with the care she used at the desk. Dates, small triumphs, the stubbornness of kids who came back to class because a book had surprised them. Richard listened with attention that didn't compute with the kind of attention she received as Mrs. Anderson. He didn't measure her with the polite economy William used. He measured her with curiosity. He asked questions and then asked better ones, the kind that expected thoughtful answers. William noticed. It was not that he could not see the room. He could, and he saw it with a precision that reduced scale to detail. But he was not accustomed to being awakened by a sight. When Richard laughed at something Emily said, a candid, delighted sound, William felt something like a tightening at the base of his throat. It was the first time in years that his vision had blurred just enough to make edges dangerous. There was an old code among the powerful. You mark what belongs to you by the signals you send. William, who had learned to send signals through boardrooms and stock forecasts, misapplied that lesson in the shimmer of a hotel ballroom. He extended his arm and, without a word, guided Emily closer to him in a way that made the photographers pivot and the guests adjust. Their hands met, not with the slow unfolding of 2 decades of love, but as a punctuation mark. He took her hand, palm to palm, with the barest pressure. The cameras clicked. Somewhere in the ballroom, a whisper began, not yet a rumor, but enough to set the air moving. Emily felt the press of his fingers, and instinctively she let her hand rest for a beat. She did not pull away immediately. Part of her was surprised by the sensation of contact, a private geography she'd nearly forgotten existed. "Emily," Richard said, easing toward them, "you have an astonishing way with people." "I meant what I said about the program. Have you ever considered doing this on a larger scale?" William's grip tightened in response to the offer. He did not speak for a beat, and no one expected him to. When he did speak, his voice had the same smooth, corporate veneer. "Mrs. Anderson is deeply committed to education," he said. "Perhaps there is room for collaboration." His sentence was both an offer and a barricade. Richard smiled as if he read the tension as an invitation rather than a threat. "Collaboration, then," he said. "I have a foundation that seeks innovative educational models. If you're open to it, I'd love to discuss possibilities." The way he said it made the room tilt. For Emily, it was an opening. For William, it was a fissure. Walking back to their car that night, William's jaw worked as if adjusting a hinge. The streetlights made columns of him, statuesque and controlled. Emily walked beside him with the awareness of someone who had stepped into a light and been seen without asking for the spotlight. It felt, in its smallness, dangerous. He did not apologize for the night. He did not need to. But in the days after, he performed small, inconsistent things that were harder to name than an apology. He left a note on the nightstand, a single sentence thanking her for attending. He asked her once how the children in her program had been responding to the curriculum changes he had read about. He organized a bouquet of flowers with a card that read, "For visibility." Emily cataloged them quietly, like inventory. Each gesture was earned because it cost him something he had taken for granted. Still, she kept a watchful distance. Habits like being unseen do not vanish because someone decides to look. Richard, meanwhile, did not retreat. He followed up with an email that shimmered with offers, funding options, consultancy roles, a proposal to bring Emily's after-school model into some of the city's most neglected pockets.
The language felt like validation, and also like a door. He proposed a meeting for coffee in a neighborhood bistro, not far from the Anderson office. It was a real invitation to do the work she loved at a scale she had only whispered about in staff rooms. Emily wanted it. The proposal invited agency back into her body, an opportunity to be seen for what she did, not just whom she married. She told William of the meeting as she would tell a partner about an errand. She expected the professional nod that had cost nothing before, but the look that crossed his face stopped her mid-sentence. It was not permission he offered. It was a claim. "Take me with you," he said. "I will attend." She almost laughed at the absurdity, at the violence of it. William's attendance at such a meeting would be overbearing, strategic, a presence intended to ensure no one overreached. But when she thought of her parents and the way worry mapped itself on her mother's face, she put her hand on the doorknob and said, "All right."
They sat at a window table. Richard was affable and direct, asking about goals and constraints with the kind of practicality money tends to purchase. William listened, and every so often he interjected, softly at first, then with an opinion that smelled of balance sheets. His voice carried the authority of someone who could make funding happen and unmake reputations. For a moment, the conversation threaded through practicalities, until it snagged and changed texture. "You have a program," William said, leaning forward in a way that was unfamiliar in intimacy and intimately familiar in negotiation. "Show me the plan that scales." Emily laid out figures and human needs, the kind of language that combined budget with heart. Richard leaned in and asked the questions that made her answer in detail. He listened as if what she said could, in fact, alter something. William listened as if what she said might alter his control. The waiter brought an espresso. A waitress tripped on the threshold, and a cup rattled against saucers. It was an ordinary friction, the sort of tiny accident that makes the private visible. Richard reached to study the saucer, and his wrist brushed Emily's fingers. The contact was accidental, light. But William watched it, and the tightness in his jaw made his hand forget to relax. He spoke then, not with his habitual politeness, but with raw firmness. "That's enough," he said, standing. It was not a plea or an invitation. The table went quiet. The other patrons turned, the city pausing to lend a moment its attention. Richard's charm faltered only for a second. He could see the line William had drawn without words. Emily felt the room narrow so that nothing existed outside of them. "Is there a problem, Mr. Anderson?" Richard asked. He was still smiling, a practiced conductor of the room. William's eyes did not leave her face. "No," he said. "Only that personal meetings should remain professional." The accusation, then as it was, landed with weight. Emily's cheeks warmed, not from embarrassment, but from the memory of things she had promised herself. She had not asked to be claimed. She had accepted a bargain. The glare of the cafe lights painted the table's edge like a dividing line. They left in an uncomfortable procession. William put his hand in hers once as they stepped out, fingers finding fingers with a deliberate pressure. Photographs later would call it a public claim, and columnists would pen metaphors about ownership and awakening. For Emily, it was 2 fingers, a palm, more than 3 years had given her. It felt less like protection than proof. The incident proliferated. People spoke of the moment in the cafe, as though the city could archive emotions like photographs. Richard, for his part, did not withdraw. He sent a thoughtful message thanking Emily for her time and asking if they might convene again with a few curriculum specialists. His email smelled of opportunity. William's response to that email was terse and formal, but in private he paced at night, calling up files he had not touched for months and rereading sections of agreements that used to mean only business. Those nocturnes became his new habit. He found himself stepping into the library at 2 a.m., looking at a photograph of his father smiling at a younger version of himself, a man who had not learned to ask for anything. William had been raised to negotiate, to broker power, to substitute affection with the calculus influence. But the sharpness of jealousy felt corrosive in him. It opened a small, sore place where tenderness might grow if watered. He didn't know how to water it. Instead, he cultivated small, awkward acts that looked on paper like attempts at connection. To see her, he told no one. To be with her. He brought coffee to Emily's room some mornings and left it by the door with a note, for the woman who saved her parents. He sat in the garden at nights and learned the shapes of the constellations, until she would emerge to water the roses and find him waiting like a secret. It was clumsy, human, and the kind of thing that could be misread as manipulation. It had to speak louder than it felt, he thought, because gestures were all his vocabulary at the moment. Emily catalogued these attempts like raindrops on a window pane, each one visible, each one falling in its own predictable path. She allowed some and refused others. A hand on the small of her back guiding her through a crowd she accepted. A kiss placed on the cheek to quiet a conversation she did not. She felt her body respond in unexpected ways, an old muscle remembering a chord, but she kept her boundaries like a map. It was during one of those nights, after a luncheon that boasted donors and promises, that Richard invited her to a private showing of a pilot program. He wanted her honest appraisal. Emily accepted, with the flinty curiosity of someone tasting a possibility. William asked to attend. She told him no. She wanted a meeting where she could speak without the echo of her marriage, where words to be evaluated on their own merits. He did not respect the no. He came anyway. The dinner that followed was small and private, a rooftop that smelled faintly of citrus and distant traffic. They ate under a sky that tried to look indifferent to human dramas. At one point during the meal, a server brought a platter that tipped, sending a bloom of sauce across the linen. Richard made a quick, gallant joke and reached for a napkin. He brushed Emily's wrist to steady the dish. It was an unremarkable brush. William's voice cut across the table like glass. "That's enough." This time the words landed less as an assertion and more as a crack. The assembled guests, anglers for gossip and investors viewing love like any other asset, watched as a man whose life had been a series of careful acquisitions publicly announced his displeasure.
Emily's face flamed with embarrassment, though again, it wasn't shame that burned. It was the old ache of someone who had been traded for stability. She pulled her hand away, not because she wanted to retreat, but because she had decided she would not be the pawn in a scene that reduced her to a symbol. "William," she said, low enough not to draw the crowd into their private friction, "please." He stood. The sort of people who sat at their table moved like weather. A hush fell. He stepped in front of her with a small, theatrically possessive movement no one with a public image would usually perform. He did not touch her then. He put words around her instead, the words of a man who knew how to own narratives. "This is my wife," he said, and there was no question in his voice. The spectators nodded for the cameras. Photos of the pronouncement would later be retouched to look tender or raw, depending on the publication. For Emily, in that instantaneous moment, his declaration felt like being displayed, catalogued. She felt an indignity and a protection at the same time, contradictory things that people with stories like hers often had to hold. The rest of the night became a blur of private arguments wound into public smiles. Emily left early, under the pretense of a headache and a need for rest. She took a cab and sat in the back seat while Los Angeles slipped by in noises and neon. Her mind listened to the argument she had muted for years, the ledger that had become her life, and the sudden, dangerous thaw of feeling that came when someone else began to admire her. Richard's earnestness meant a door to work. William's sudden attention meant a change in the terms of ownership. At the house, he waited in the study, as if the house itself had been impatient for him. He looked smaller in that room than he ever did under the weight of global markets. The portraits on the wall seemed to look down with the old father's merciless calm. Emily opened the door and found him there, hands in his pockets, the way a man stands when he needs to be at once vulnerable and immovable. "I didn't want a scene," she said. "There are ways to be private," he replied, the words stripped of their usual armor. "I didn't ask for you to control everything," she said, surprising herself with the sharpness. She wondered at the tone in her throat, that older, steadier note that used to sway teenagers to care about words. The more she spoke, the more that voice answered. He took a step closer, the kind of step that meant negotiation rather than intimacy. "I don't want to control everything," he said. "I only want to protect what is mine." The phrase landed like a verdict. Emily felt the old ledger in her hands, its cold pages opening with a complaint. She could see how easily this protection could become a cage. "I am not an item," she said. "I am not—" "You are my wife," he interrupted, and it sounded like a closing statement.
She left the study that night and slept on the guest room couch, the sound of traffic a lullaby that did not belong to her. Morning came with its usual rituals: coffee, a plate set, a distance between two people who had been taught to measure intimacy with contracts. But something had changed. William's attention, however fraught, had inched toward him. It had the softness of someone learning a new instrument. It had the jaggedness of someone who had practiced only scales. Richard's messages continued to arrive, ringing the way hope does when it has capital behind it. He requested another meeting, this time in his office, this time with a few educational strategists present. He specified a small fee for the consultancy and offered equity in a nonprofit venture that would grow and grow like a public flame.
Emily read the email and felt the heat of possibility. To accept it would mean stepping into visibility in a way her marriage had, until recently, denied her. She planned to decline. She told herself she would keep the work within the contours the marriage allowed. But opportunity edges the corners of a person's life very thinly. Take one step, and the margin changes. On a Tuesday, when April had the peculiar Los Angeles habit of pretending it was still winter, she slipped into William's office to return a book she had borrowed. She had always avoided that room, respect, fear, the kind of boundaries some doors demand. The desk was large enough to host an argument, and the chair behind it wore the imprint of decision. She moved with the casual confidence of a woman returning something that belonged to the house, and for reasons she could not explain, let her curiosity follow. There were papers tucked in the bottom drawer, legal folders with Anderson Holdings stamped on the covers, signatures in line like little soldiers. Something in their seam called to her, because knowledge, even the smallest, had been a currency she had used all her life. She slid a hand inside and pulled a thin folder free. At first there was nothing but the smell of paper and ink. Then she saw the document, a contract memorandum, a clause marked in legal shorthand that made a pattern like a brand. It tied her name, Emily Peterson, later Mrs. Anderson, to a specific corporate leverage, a merger between Anderson Holdings and a chain of private schools. The marriage was not only a private agreement, it was an instrument in a corporate strategy. The document detailed contingencies, financial arrangements, and a list of signatures. The clinical language read like arithmetic of a human life. Her breath left her in a small secret sound. The house seemed to tilt. All the mornings, the dinners, the nightstand notes, everything folded into a reason that had a name on paper and a value attached. The ledger had a footnote that named her as more than daughter, more than wife, an asset. She sat down on the office chair and nearly laughed, a small, unmoored sound.
How many times had she told herself she could live with the bargain because the alternative was worse? How many times had her parents wept with gratitude without seeing the clause that had tied her fate to corporate growth? There was anger that felt ancestral, tired from bearing the weight of another's rescue. William's voice behind her was not the deep baritone of a man who had planned this moment. It was closer, rawer. "You shouldn't be in here," he said. She did not look up at first. She had not prepared a confrontation or an argument. She had only intended to return a book. Now there was no escaping the fact that the book was a key. "What are you doing here?" she asked finally, and the words surprised her with their steadiness. "Why is this?" He took the folder from her hand like a man who had been stripped bare of his defenses. For a beat there was nothing between them but the paper and the floor. Then he sat down opposite her, the office feeling like a small theater. "You wanted to know the terms," he said. His voice was quiet, which made it worse. "You signed. It saved your parents." "It saved them," she echoed, hearing the past in the present. "It also makes me a bargaining chip." He flinched as if struck by an old calculus. For a man who had always believed in the sanctity of agreements, William now saw the human face of a letter. "I never intended for you to feel like a commodity," he said. His hands trembled just slightly as he folded the folder into his lap. "That is not how I've thought of you." She looked at him, at the vulnerability that made him less an unassailable figure and more a person who feared admitting mistakes. "Then how did you think of me?" she asked. His answer was not immediate. When it came, it was full of the terrible candor as someone realizing that their life strategy had been designed without a human heart in it. "As part of a solution," he began. "As a measure. I thought, it's what I was taught. It kept things in order." Emily felt the world condense into a single shimmering point of decision. She could leave the folder on the desk, close the drawer, step back into the same life of quiet servitude and polite smiles. She could also, if she took the small, sharp breath, refuse to let the ledger speak for her future any longer. Outside the office, Los Angeles carried on, oblivious and indifferent. Inside, two people who had been arranged into one another's orbit finally saw the other in a way that required naming more than notation. The evidence sat between them like a third presence, legal, inky, merciless. William leaned forward, and for the first time he reached with something that was not a negotiation but a plea. "Help me," he said. "Help me make this right." Emily held the folder like a map whose borders had shifted. The city hummed, and for the first time in a long while she felt a tiny pulse of power, not because someone had given it back, but because she could take it.
She held the folder like a cold thing between her palms,
and watched William's face as if it had been sketched in a language she was only now learning to read. He had offered her a plea that was not polished, not strategic, a plain request that trembled with a quality she had not thought possible from him: humility. "Help me," he had said. "Help me make this right." The sentence landed in the room and did not dissolve. It sat there, impatient and earnest, demanding an answer that was not ledgered and not negotiated. Emily folded the papers back into the folder with slow fingers. The paper made a small, domestic sound. For all the contracts and clauses that had arranged their lives, for all the accountants and signatures that kept the Anderson empire turning, the moment narrowed down to two people alone in an office with a view of a city that did not bow. "You mean how?" she asked. Her voice was quiet enough to be a conversation with herself. "Do you mean pennies and press releases, or do you mean the things that will actually alter what I wanted in the first place?" William's eyes found hers. He had been practiced in measuring risk. Now he measured his own contingencies as if they were new and unfamiliar territory. "Both," he said, and the single word was honest. "The contractual part, I'll withdraw Anderson Holdings' support for the merger. I can propose that at the board meeting on Friday. I can—" He stopped, as though the simplest of actions was a monster he had to name carefully. "I can return the initial funds and recommend we end the negotiations." Emily's jaw tightened. She had heard promises from men like him. Words were easy. Signatures, on paper intended to unmake her, were heavier. "This isn't just money," she said. "This is my life on a page. If you undo the merger, will you also do what it takes to make sure you can't reinsert those terms later? Will your father have the ability to make the same offer to someone else in 5 years?" He blinked, a small human reflex. "I'll sign an affidavit saying I initiated the rescindment," he said. "I'll put a clause in the release that prevents the company from pursuing any transfer where you are named as consideration. I'll instruct our lawyers to file the paperwork publicly. I'll go to the press and say I was wrong." "It's not enough to say it," Emily answered. "It has to be unambiguous, and it has to be legal in such a way that your fingerprints are on it. I won't allow my life to be a footnote again." He listened like a man taking instruction. "Then tell me what to do," he said. "Tell me what will prove it." The exchange felt like a beginning and a reckoning at once. For the first time since she had walked into that conference room so many years ago, Emily understood that William had the capacity to change how he moved through the world, not by theatrical pronouncement, but by choice. That realization did not ease the ache of the past. It complicated it. "You must do it in public," she said, "and you must let me decide how we proceed from there. My terms, no more being used as a signal. You undo the merger, you make the legal renunciation concrete, and you accept whatever consequences come at the company. After that, if you still want anything between us, it will be on different terms." He nodded once, a movement that felt like it required more courage than most men ever had to muster in a boardroom. "I'll do it," he said. She left his office with the folder clutched to her chest, but not because she believed the papers themselves had weight. She left because the room had become too small for everything it now contained: the bargaining and the confession, the ledger and the possibility. That night, she packed a small bag and booked a room at a modest hotel in downtown Los Angeles. It was the sort of place that did not offer name recognition or social currency. It offered instead a bed free of portraits and the illusion of anonymity. She wanted to sleep where no portrait presided over her. William did not follow her immediately. He spent the hours after she had left on his phone, calling lawyers and pressing palms of skin like a man trying to empty fear from his chest. He moved through the house as if it were a maze of decisions: the study, the library, the gallery where the company's framed years seemed to whisper their judgments. At 3 in the morning, he sent an email to the board requesting emergency time on the agenda. It was the first overt sign that he was willing to stake something much larger than reputation. By Friday, the news had seeped into the fluorescent world of markets and morning programs. Anderson Holdings had lodged notice to halt merger negotiations pending board review. The rumor mills, slick with gossip and speculation, sputtered with theories. Robert Anderson was not pleased. He sent a terse cable to his son: "You understand the consequences." The old patriarch's language was cordial-sounding but meathful. It named a code and an expectation that generations obeyed. William felt the first cut of consequence within hours. Calls came from senior partners, from investment banks that had expected a certain calculus to remain intact. Opinion pieces appeared online, quick to frame his move as either a moral awakening or a reckless betrayal of shareholder value. He sat through a meeting with the legal team where complex phrases were used to explain the mechanics of reversing commitments. The mechanics mattered, but they were not the crux of what William felt. The crux was that he was making a choice that would cost him, possibly dearly, and he was doing it because Emily had asked him to.
At the hotel, Emily paced in a small rectangle of space that contained a television and 2 comfortable chairs. For the first time in a long while, she watched the city like someone who was not slated as part of someone else's plan.
There were nights when loneliness pressed against the window like humid heat. There were mornings when the sound of street vendors below seemed to stitch the city to her again. She read the emails Richard sent with a mixture of desire and suspicion. He wrote with a clarity that respected her autonomy. He proposed launching a pilot program with his foundation under a joint advisory board. Part of her hunger for work hinge-sprung at the idea, but she resisted rapid choices. She wanted to be the one to decide how her life expanded. She wanted to keep the newfound leverage real. A week into her exile, she woke with a strange, queasy certainty and stumbled to the bathroom. The stick was tiny and luminous, and the result imparted a stillness that was at once ecstatic and terrifying. She sat on the edge of the tub and let the news settle like a bird on a windowsill. There was a child in her, a life that had been growing while contracts were signed and while men had debated numbers. The revelation sharpened everything: her judgment, her fear, her stubbornness. She did not call William that night. The feeling in her chest was complicated by the ledger that had once named her a device of leverage. She wanted the pregnancy to be her private thing, at least for a while. She wanted to decide how it would be revealed, not have it become part of any corporate narrative. So she carried the secret like a small shining stone and walked the streets of downtown Los Angeles as if she had been given a new sense of direction. The city watched her with indifferent lights. When William heard the initial rumors that the merger was being unwound, he felt dazed and oddly light. Reporters phoned, some politely, some with the sharpness of sharks. His father sent a letter demanding explanation, but also a roster of legal counsel. The board called a meeting, and the air in the conference room felt thin. William rose to speak and laid out his case not as a speech, but as an apology rendered in decisions. He explained bluntly that the normal calculus had been wrong because it had treated human lives like assets. He said he had made a terrible choice once, and that he would correct what lay within his power. Robert listened with the silence of someone who had built a machine out of lives and now heard the machine accused of failing. "This company was built on opportunities," his father said. "You are playing with precedent." "I understand that," William replied, "but there are precedents we don't want to set, that we can't allow to be normalized. This was one of them." The vote was narrow and public. Some board members balked. Some executives, used to the tidy resolutions of numbers, feared how a personal decision might send ripples through markets. The legal team wired the necessary documents to formally end the negotiation and to renounce any terms where an individual's name could be used as bargaining consideration. William signed.
He handed over an affidavit that explicitly renounced the use of Emily's marriage as a financial instrument. He also gave instructions to release a public statement acknowledging the misstep and the decision to halt the merger. For many outside the room, the event was a spectacle. William Anderson, the heir, stepping back from a deal that promised expansion. For those inside, it was a small revolution, a man breaking from a pattern that had been normalized by corporate logic. Price took its toll. Anderson Holdings stock dipped, then steadied. PR teams wrote drafts and then rewrote them with a mind toward nuance. Robert Anderson called his son inelegant names and threatened consequences that sounded ancient. But William had already accepted that consequences could be severe and that some things were worth the cost. Emily watched the unfolding news from her small kitchenette at the hotel. She listened to a radio program that dissected the business implications and to callers who had opinions sharp as knives. When the formal statement appeared, when William publicly renounced the contract instrument and took responsibility, she felt something shift in her chest that was not only relief. It was an evidence that sometimes signing the paper is not the point. It's what you do when the signature reveals the truth of your choices. Yet relief did not erase the ache. She had given away parts of herself for pragmatic reasons, and that could not be undone by a press release. Words had limits. She wanted to see real consequences, changes in how the company treated issues of influence, a cessation of the quiet code that equated women with strategic advantage. She wanted to see William willing to face the music of his father's disappointment and the scorn of shareholders. When the press called him reckless, she also felt a hum of pity for the man trying to articulate that human value was not for sale. In the week between William's announcement and the board's formal vote, there were small, tentative messages exchanged between them.
He sent a photograph of a notebook in which he had written down actions and timelines. She received an envelope with a handwritten copy of the affidavit he had signed. There was a letter, no flourish, no pleading, simply a list of changes he was initiating. A company policy forbidding personal negotiations tied to marital status, new oversight for philanthropic arms, an independent audit of recent deals that may have used similar leverage. Actions like these were not glamorous, but they mattered. And still, despite the public gestures and legal steps, something crucial remained fragile: trust. Trust is not repaired by signage and legal ease alone. It grows slowly, often in the small, repeated things that show a person is not the sum of a single decision. Meanwhile, Richard approached carefully. He respected Emily's distance and wrote with a warmth tempered by propriety.
He proposed a pilot that would place Emily at the head of a new initiative with funding that would not be tied to Anderson Holdings. Use our foundation as a platform, but keep governance independent, he wrote. It was tempting. The offer promised actual work and real impact without the strings she feared. She met him twice, once at a library that smelled of paper and rain, and once at a community center where a cohort of children performed a crude play about space on a cracked stage. Richard listened, genuinely and without calculation, to the story of a woman who had taught and loved and refused to be a commodity. He offered mentorship, access, and organized network. He did not press beyond that. He admitted to admiration, always respectfully, and left the decision in her hands. When she finally told him she would not accept immediate operational control, he surprised her by smiling, genuinely. "I don't want to crowd you," he said. "I want to build with you, or step aside if you prefer. The work doesn't need to be dramatic. It needs to be done well." At the hotel, Emily spent some evenings writing lists for herself. She listed what she wanted in no uncertain terms: autonomy, a public guarantee against being used as leverage, a career rebuild, and, after the pregnancy, the shape of a life that included this child on her discretion, not as a bargaining tool. The lists steadied her. Word of William's legal action reached his father like a caustic wind. Robert felt betrayed. In his mind, family decisions and corporate decisions had always been woven tightly. "You've undermined what we do," he told William in a conversation that had the polite tenor of a negotiation between wills. "We hold power because we understand leverage. You are softening the family." "I am not softening," William replied. "I am choosing people over precedent." "You could have chosen differently," Robert said. "You could have found a way to make this honorable." William's face was a map of exhaustion. "I try to make things honorable by making them humane," he said. The argument stalled against the immovable weight of a man who had never seen softness as a virtue. As the weeks passed, the intensity of public interest dwindled, markets adjusted, pundits found new prey. William began to feel the effects of his choice at a personal level. Colleagues who had once flocked now kept a distance. Partners who had expected favors warned they would reconsider. It was a stern, valuable test for him. He accepted it with a kind of steadying grief. One late afternoon, 2 weeks after Emily had moved into the hotel, William went to see her. He did not enter with florid gestures or grand pronouncements. He took the metro to a stop he had never used before, climbed stairs that had no butler to open, and found the hotel's small lounge. He asked for Emily and waited like a man who had learned that waiting without entitlement was part of repair.
She sat with a book in her lap when he came in, the kind of nonchalance that belongs to people who need to practice being ordinary. She looked the same and not at all the same. There was a purposeful edge to the way she folded the page. He took a chair across from her, and for a moment neither spoke. "I signed the public renunciation," he said finally. "I asked the lawyers to append protective clauses. I told the board I was prepared to step down from any committee if necessary. I have been called everything, reckless, sentimental, but I have been trying to do the right thing." "You did more than that," Emily replied. "You made a very public choice that would have cost you. I saw the press release." He nodded. "I want you to know I did it because you asked me to, not to win you back, because I was wrong and because I thought it should stop." She watched him, and in her face a worry flickered. "What about your father? Did he retaliate?" "He said some things I didn't like," William admitted. "He has made clear that he thinks I am betraying a heritage. He mentioned the possibility of being reined in, but I am willing to face that." Outside the window, the city smudged into late light. For a moment, the room was simply a place where two people looked at each other across a small table, and it felt almost scandalous that such a thing could be tender.
"I should tell you something," she said then, and the words were small but catastrophic. "I'm pregnant." The way she said it made the air change temperature. For a beat, William was like someone who had waited too long for rain to begin, and then saw it fall unexpectedly from a clear sky. He reached out, uncertainly, and laid his hand near hers. It was not a touch with entitlement, it was a seeking. "You didn't tell me because you wanted to decide how and when," he said softly. "I understand." She nodded. "I didn't want it to be another bargaining chip." He exhaled, a long, shaky thing. "I won't let it become that," he said. "Whatever you decide, about this child, about us, I will respect. I will not try to force any narrative on you." Those were small words, but they were some of the most important he could offer now. A promise of respect, a vow that consent would be honored in the future. Emily let his hand rest near hers for the length of 3 heartbeats, then withdrew as if testing the water. They spent the day that followed talking in a way they had rarely spoken in 3 years, not as functionaries in a family economy, but as two people who had to decide how they might share a life free of terms. William did not plead. He answered questions frankly. He admitted his ignorance about raising a child, his fear of his father's reaction, his willingness to sacrifice corporate standing if necessary.
Emily, for her part, laid out boundaries clearly. She would not be the public face without voice. She wanted governance control for all projects that bore her name, and she wanted to be part of any decision that affected their family. The list felt like a contract of a different kind, one built of mutual consent rather than coercion. "Would you consider a joint venture?" she asked at one point. "A nonprofit that is genuinely independent, with an advisory board that includes people from the communities we want to help, with transparent funding and real accountability." William listened and then smiled, a tentative thing. "Yes," he said, "and if you will have me as a partner, I will put my resources into it in a way that does not give Anderson Holdings control. I'll place the funding in a trust with independent trustees." That sentence contained the bones of a shared project, not a romantic gesture, but a governance architecture that honored her autonomy. It was precisely the kind of thing that signaled progress. They drafted it in fragments on napkins, in emails, at 2 small meetings at the library. It was slow, deliberate, and legalistic in ways that mattered to Emily, because structure could prevent future manipulation. Yet not everyone was willing to accept the change. Robert Anderson escalated his opposition. He convened a family council and issued a formal reprimand to his son in the pages of a newspaper column that read like a moral indictment. The attack was not only personal, it was an attempt to shame William into returning to the previous orthodoxy. "A family does not flinch from opportunities," the column read. "We steward assets for continuity." William read the column and turned it over in his hands like a physical object. He could have retreated. He did not. In a press conference, he announced his intention to step down from certain committees if the board thought that action necessary for continuity, and he reiterated his commitment to the new philanthropic model. The move cost him influence, but it also showed a willingness to carry the burden of consequences. In the midst of that tumult, Emily made a choice about Richard. She called him and told him gently that she had appreciated his proposal, but that she needed to take time to shape her work in a way that would not be rushed. Richard, demonstrating the decency that had first attracted her trust, responded without bitterness. He offered to serve as an advisor on the pilot program and to introduce Emily to funders who could maintain independence. He asked nothing in return but the chance to support a cause he believed in. "I want you to be the one to choose," he said. "If you choose William, it must be because it is right for you, not because it is convenient." Time had a peculiar way of smoothing and sharpening all at once. The pregnancy, when it was revealed to the public, became a private storm and a public curiosity. A photograph slipped into a tabloid. Someone had glimpsed Emily leaving the hotel, and speculation ran wild. The press asked questions that had nothing to do with pedagogy and everything to do with scandal. William, to his credit, did not try to control the narrative by climbing onto platforms to call for forgiveness. Instead, he continued to implement structural changes and to shoulder the business fallout. His quiet consistency began to do the work of proof where words sometimes failed. Finally, after months of negotiation, legal filings, and small gestures that accumulated like a ledger of a different kind, Emily agreed to return to the house, not as a woman who would disappear into the role assigned to her, but as a partner who had established terms. They were both wary, and in their wariness, careful. They spoke with lawyers and clergy, not to sanctify a bargain, but to draft a marriage covenant of a new design, one that emphasized agency, consent, and shared governance in both familial and philanthropic matters. They married again in the backyard of the Anderson house in a small private ceremony. The garden had been trimmed without ostentation. The azaleas held the last whispers of spring. David and Sarah Peterson stood on one side, hands linked, faces washed with relief and something like pride. Robert Anderson, compact and scrutinous, stood by his chair with a face that suggested unresolved calculation. He did not clap as the vows were spoken. He did not faint into melodrama. He watched, which in itself was a small concession. The officiant spoke words of intention, no grand theatrical pronouncements to the world, only promises exchanged between two people who had built new terms for being seen. Emily's vow was not long, but it was exacting. She promised to build with the person before her, to keep the child sovereign of its own life, and to hold him accountable when needed. William's vow was to respect her agency always, to ensure structural protections for her work, and to accept any cost that came from protecting human dignity. They sealed the vows with a kiss that was not performative, just a touch full of consent and mutuality, a closing of hands rather than a takeover. After the ceremony, they inaugurated their joint foundation, the Peterson-Anderson Institute for Equitable Education. The governance model was unusual and deliberate: equal seats for community representatives, an independent board, funding in an irrevocable trust, and an advisory council made up of educators from neighborhoods Emily knew intimately. It was not a vanity project. It required William to step back from direct control and to trust people he had previously overlooked. He accepted the constraint and used his resources to underwrite long-term sustainability rather than the short-term optics of a high-profile donation.
Emily was named as CEO with operational control, and a transparent mission was published. No clauses, no footnotes, only a charter that spoke to measurable outcomes and community stewardship. The months that followed were the slow work of rebuilding. Small domestic scenes stitched the two of them back together in ways that were not cinematic, but were real. William making coffee and learning recipes that were not labeled by the status of the household. Emily teaching him how to braid a blanket for the child. Both of them standing in a classroom listening to a child read a book they had funded. There were setbacks, board members who questioned Emily's acumen, journalists who mistook their kindness for weakness. But there were also small, luminous victories. A school that adopted the Peterson after-school model and reported improved literacy rates. A neighborhood center that gained internet access because of equipment purchased by a trust. Emily laughing in a way that opened her face, the way she used to when she taught teenagers about narrative. Robert was not the same man at the end of the first year. He watched from the periphery as the institute showed results. He remained reserved, sometimes harsh, but there were moments when he would appear at a meeting and ask a pointed question that suggested a curiosity he had not admitted before. He did not offer apologies for his earlier stance. He did something perhaps more significant. He began to ask for explanations of effect, to demand data, and to provide resources on those terms. It was not full reconciliation. It was a truce of sorts, a recognition that his son had chosen a course he did not understand, but that the outcome, if measurable and respectable, merited attention. The pregnancy progressed slowly into autumn and then into winter. The child's presence was not allowed to become public in the sensational way tabloids had once hoped. Emily's lines were honored. The pregnancy remained private until she chose to announce it. When she did, it was with a short letter to the Institute and to the families her program served, framed not as a celebrity announcement, but as an intimate sharing. People responded with warmth and respect. Labor arrived in the small hours of a windless night. William paced the hospital corridor like a man relearning how to breathe. He had read every book Emily suggested, taken Lamaze classes at her gentle insistence, and most of all, learned how to care without needing to lay claim. The child's birth was, in all its chaotic tenderness, both a private miracle and a public testament to change. When the nurse placed the squalling little body on Emily's chest, William wept like someone who had been taught to hold his emotions in reserve, and now found the valve opened. They named the child Nora, for Emily's grandmother, a woman who had taught her to read by lamplight and had never known a mortgage-free life. In the following weeks, sleeplessness and small domestic rituals filled their days. They learned to divide night shifts and to respect the other's need for sleep.
The mansion softened around the edges as a child's footprint was added to the hallway floor. The presence of a baby did something subtle to the house. It required loudness and imperfection, and the acceptance of both. Several months later, at a small community event, a classroom proudly displayed letters from children who attended the Institute's after-school program. Emily read them with a mixture of gratitude and fierce pride. William stood behind her, hands folded, and when the small author, a little boy with a crooked smile, ran up and hugged him, William did not pull away. The little gesture felt emblematic. A man who had once been defined by control, now being hugged by a child he had helped create a chance for. Richard remained in their orbit as an ally who had not sought to be the hero of the tale. He had funded a pilot and watched it grow. He visited the classroom and left with a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with ownership. He had not used Emily's turmoil for leverage. He had been generous in ways that were quietly transformative. Years later, the Institute published its third-year report showing measurable gains in literacy and increased school retention in neighborhoods they targeted. The report was widely praised not because of money alone, but because the governance model had invited community voices to the table. Emily appeared in interviews more often now, not as a symbol, but as a leader who had built systems that worked. William supported her work financially and morally, and he also learned to give credit without expecting it to come attached to his name. On slow evenings, when Los Angeles threw indigo across the garden, they would walk hand in hand and talk about the odd trajectory their lives had taken. William sometimes admitted, in a low voice, that the months of cost and derision had been harder than he had expected. Emily would listen and sometimes reply with a memory from her own childhood, a ledger that had been full of obligations until someone rewrote the entries. They seldom spoke in the language of triumph. They spoke in the language of care. Their life together retained a complexity that had nothing to do with fairy tales. There were arguments about schedules, about publicity, about boundaries when the old world tried to snap back into place. There were also small, luminous acts. William showing up as a parent with a scraped knee, Emily sitting in a boardroom and insisting that community members have the last word. There was what mattered most. They had reshaped the terms of the bargain that had once defined them. The epilogue of their story was not neat.
It was instead an accumulation of choices. A man who traded the calculus of leverage for the humbling work of repair. A woman who reclaimed her agency and used a platform to build something that could not be easily repurposed. A child who arrived in a household that had learned to respect its members as ends, not means. The city of Los Angeles, with its glitter and indifference, remained capable of spectacle, but now their story lived more in classrooms than in columns. On an ordinary Sunday, months after the initial public confrontation, the three of them walked through a Saturday market. Nora toddled between their hands, laughing intermittently. Emily watched the way sun caught William's hair and the ease of his smile. It was not the dramatic claiming in a hotel ballroom the papers once insisted upon. It was quieter, more intimate. That private claiming, the one made of daily consent and shared labor, felt like the truest declaration. If you sat at a cafe in another city and overheard them, you might think it was simply a family taking a morning. If you followed the legal filings in the press, you might think the story was a tale of power relinquished. The truth was simpler and more complicated. People can change. Change is neither a single act nor an easy one. It is, most often, the long geography of repeated choice. Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments. And if this story moved you, subscribe and leave a rating from 0 to 10. Tell us what you would do in Emily's place.